we documented stories about how children were rounded up in September. They used to call September the crying month because people, that's what they remembered about September, was crying, children crying, because that's when they were taken from the parents. I remember one story of a couple of a brother and sister. They said how happy and excited they were. They're going to go on this plane ride. So their parents paddled over to this float plane. They were put on a float plane and they flew to Ottawa. Never been to a city, so they overnighted there, got put on a train for 3 days to Edmonton. Edmonton, they were put on another plane to go north to Aklavik, Inuvik. So when they look back, they said, you know, that's 2,500 miles from home. I thought I was bad. I was only 3 miles from home. But the reason I tell you that story is because many children tried to run away from school. We heard many horrific stories of children drowning, trying to cross a river, freezing to death in a wintertime, trying to run away from home. So we write about how children were rounded up, sometimes in cattle trucks. They were put in trucks, trains. So we did a publication on They Came for the Children. We did an interim report to test how serious is Canada about reconciliation. So we made some preliminary calls to action. I should say we called them recommendations at the time. And then we documented these stories that we heard into a publication called The Survivors Speak. Because I remember being told, what makes you think you're going to believe me? I've told my story 5 times, 7 times. Nobody believes me. What makes you think you're going to believe me? So we did a publication in their own words about their story. So then when we were about to do our report, just coincidentally, there had been a study done on words that are used for reports, like conclusion, suggestion, recommendation, all these different words that are used. And there was actually a study done on what's the easiest word to ignore in the report. Recommendation. That's the easiest word. And we've had studies. I remember looking at the justice system here in Canada as a commissioner to look at how many studies have been done on a justice system, I asked myself. There had been 33. There had been over 3,000 recommendations, and we were still filling up the prisons. So we thought what we need is not more recommendations. We had the Royal Commission report, 400 and some recommendations. What we need now is action. And not too many calls to action. So we decided to use the term calls to action. And it's important now to reflect back on that and how important that little difference has made. We're not ordered by the court to report on the missing children, but we did because we kept hearing about children that never came home. As I said, there's a picture in my mind. It's etched in my mind of 4 little boys huddled together, frozen to death. So we wrote about the missing children. When we finished our work, it was 4,300 children. We identified how they died, where they died, where they're buried, because families didn't know that. They didn't know what happened to their relative. All they remember was he or she being taken away. I remember one woman in tears. She said, "Mr. Commissioner, all I remember about my daughter, my little girl, was I was hanging on to her, and RCMP took one arm, Indian agent took the other one. That's the last time I saw my little girl. Mr. Commissioner, you go find her." So now I'm told it's over 6,000. And it's important for us because in our way, as Elder Jim talked about our way, we have a wake when a person dies. We have prayers, songs. We have a feast. For 4 years, we have a feast every year on the day the person died. This could not be done by families who didn't know where their relative was buried. So we did that part of the report. But then we broke down our report into themes. We started, first of all, with education, because you've heard us say that it was education that got us into this mess. But it's also and more importantly, it's education that'll get us out of this mess. So the first part of our report is dedicated to that. Culture and language, and you heard about that already this morning, about the importance. You see, when we looked at the legacy of residential school, we found that 4 elements of our way were severely assaulted by the residential school policy. First of all, it was an assault on our families. It was an assault on our communities. It was an assault on our culture and our languages. And you heard a story this morning about how important language is. And we heard Elder Sid talk about how he wasn't taught the language because his parents went to residential school. Spirituality was attacked and assaulted because it was against the law, actually, to practice spirituality. But we write about that. And on health and justice, governance, and murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We asked ourselves, what were the main teachings and lessons from these hearings, these 7,000 stories? What were the main lessons learned? And we looked at what we heard people saying. So we broke them down into 10 principles of reconciliation. And the first one is to use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. I remember when we were debating the UN Declaration, it's interesting, something happened one day and I was asked, can you go and talk to the chairperson? Because we want to open the meeting with a prayer. So I went to the chairperson and she said to me, Mr. Littlechild, you know we don't pray at the United Nations. And I said, well, it's not really a prayer, it's an invocation, it's a thanksgiving. And she said, well, how long is that going to take? You have 3 minutes, she said. So I was really happy. I went back to the elders. I said, we have 3 minutes to say an invocation. They said, we will sing a prayer song. So they came with 4 drums, 4 elders, spiritual leaders, and they're singing a prayer song. And she poked me on the elbow, says, Mr. Littlechild, it's already 7 minutes. How long are they going to take? And she says, I don't know, we can't stop the elders. You have to keep them going. But you know what happened out of that? The UN usually works with 5 bundles of rights: economic, social, cultural rights, civil, and political rights. From that day on, now, at the UN, every meeting starts with a prayer. And that was a contribution by our elders, because they were brave enough, strong enough, resilient enough to come and break the ice at the UN with a prayer song. And that's a benefit for everyone around the world, because you know what happened? There's a sixth bundle of rights now: economic, social, cultural, civil, political, and guess what? There's now spiritual rights recognized. And that's thanks to the elders for changing the world in that way. So spirituality is really important. And I think that if you look at the UN Declaration, you will see that there are specific references to spirituality. In fact, there's one that calls for action to you, all of you in this room. Because it says all faith groups or social justice groups should endorse the UN Declaration and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So not only is spiritual rights recognized now at the UN Declaration, there's a call to action for us to make sure that spirituality is implemented. It's right in the UN Declaration. There are other references like spiritual connection to lands, territories, and resources, being able to teach spirituality, religion, practices and traditions and ceremonies to children. Those are all in the UN Declaration. But when you look at the calls to action, there are 16 calls to action on the UN Declaration. For example, all the law schools from now on, all the medical schools, the nursing schools, the journalism schools, the media schools, now have to teach not only the residential school history and the legacy, but treaties and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So when we talk about the power of love, or when we talk about reconciliation being having good relations, when we talk about calls to action to make sure that we implement the UN Declaration, I think that's a call to all of us to consider this globally. Consider it globally, the Declaration as a framework for reconciliation. I close with my school. This was a school that was the largest residential school in Canada at one time. And you'll see there's the center of the building on the 4th floor is where the nuns used to live. The floor below that, and I sometimes get challenged by people when I say that was the girls' dorm. They say, "How do you know that?" Well, I had 7 sisters actually at that school, and that's where they lived. The floor below that is the classroom block, and then the dining hall below that. The building in the middle is the boys' dorm. There's big boys, medium boys, and little boys. And then there's a potato patch, a black, on the right-hand corner there's a potato patch. Had a lot of potato fights there. But you'll see in the back there's a horse barn, there's a cow barn, there's a chicken coop. It's actually a very self-sufficient. If you were to do this today, you'd get charged for child labor. But anyway, that was my school. It's the same picture, but a different angle, and I'm sorry you can't really see it. But in front of this, there's a fence. People say, "Oh, get over it." So what, the fence? Well, it's a barbed wire fence, and they say, "Well, so what?" But actually, that was an electric fence. That's in front of that school. You can see the fence, I think, from there. So I think we have an opportunity now to really expand our horizons and use the Declaration, use reconciliation, use the power of love, use inclusion, all those thematic discussions you're having here today, so that we can have good relations among all of us going forward. And I thank you very, very much for this opportunity.
It was wonderful. Come, we'll go this.
A big thank you to Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild. Wilton, Marie Wilson, and the chief, he's currently a senator in our Senate of Canada. That's Murray Sinclair. Served as the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They did a wonderful job and important work that's going to be lasting for a long, long time. I also have to a shout out to my uncle Murray Sinclair, the Honorable Murray Sinclair, the senator. He's also the Western Doorway of chief of our Three Fires Medewan Lodge. So nice to acknowledge my uncle Murray, who's not able to be here. I want to introduce you to the moderator of our next panel. This panel is about the role of women in revitalizing Indigenous communities. Tia Oros Wilson is the Executive Director of the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, an organization founded in 1977 that supports community-generated strategies for Native peoples' cultural revitalization, movement building, self-determination, and re-indigenization. Ms. Oros Wilson has extensive experience in international advocacy, including expertise in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She's also a convener and one of the founding mothers of the Global Indigenous Women's Caucus and of the World Indigenous Women's Alliance. She's a mother, a grandmother, a cultural artist, a social and cultural justice organizer, a water protector, and an advocate for the rights of Mother Earth. To moderate this panel and to welcome our panelists, please welcome Tia Oros Peters.
Good morning, brothers and sisters of the world, everyone here. Thank you to the Indigenous peoples of this area for their welcoming of us and of this conference onto their homelands, and for beginning this event, for centering it with the sacred fire, honoring Mother Earth, and recognizing the ancestors, ancient and everlasting, who are always with us and who will guide our conversations and actions over these next days together. I would like to also acknowledge the chiefs and the clan mothers, the wisdom keepers, the sacred bundle holders, the sundancers, kiva leaders, the leaders of medicine societies, of songs and of ceremonies, peoples of world renewal ceremony. Brothers and sisters of the world, my name is Tia Oros Peters. I'm Shiwi. My people are also known as the Zuni. I also carry another name, Ms. Gatset, hummingbird, in the shape of a little buckskin doll. I serve as the Executive Director of the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, which is a 41-year-old Native-created, Native-led, philanthropic, and advocacy organization. We are focused on Indigenous peoples' self-determination, on our empowerment, on our re-indigenization. We are likely one of the oldest such organizations in the world that works within all contexts of the Indigenous experience, in all places of the Indigenous world, grassroots, regionally, nationally, and internationally, including at the United Nations, where we have special consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. Core to our work is the knowledge that effective, sustainable development and actions that take place within our lands and territories, in our nations and in our communities, will only be successful if it emerges from the peoples themselves, from our own peoples, from our people's aspirations, from our methodologies, from our realities, from our dreams. And at the very core, so many times, these grow from the hearts and from the brilliant minds of Indigenous women. Indigenous peoples know the inherent power of Indigenous women, power on our own terms, not of ego or of money, not of hierarchy or oppression, not of aggression or brutality, not of war. Power as an expression of love, power as an expression of peace, of generosity, of reciprocity, power in terms of humility, dignity, honor, and grace, as a reflection of our capacity to heal, as a manifestation of our responsibilities to nurture future generations, to do more than thrive, to do more than hold on to the crevices of existence by our fingernails, to thrive. That's real power. That Indigenous women are the backbones of our nations and the hearts as well, holders of sacred knowledge, transmitters of cultures, of songs, stories, spiritualities, that Indigenous women are connected to the moon and to the tides and to the universe, the caretakers of water, the carriers of new life, possessing the regenerative power and capacity, real power, to imagine, to innovate, to implement dynamic and leading-edge strategies that are rooted, centered in the relationships to land, culture, community, and collective spirit. It is an honor to introduce to you this esteemed, this outstanding panel of Indigenous women leaders for today's plenary about the role of women in the revitalization of Indigenous communities. Our first speaker is Dr. Deborah Harry, Kuyui Takata. She is of those people from Pyramid Lake, Nevada, North America. Dr. Harry serves as a lecturer for Gender, Race, and Identity program at the University of Nevada. Dr. Harry's research analyzes the linkages between biotechnology, intellectual property, and globalization in relation to Indigenous peoples' rights. Dr. Harry has authored numerous articles related to the protection of Indigenous peoples' biodiversity and traditional knowledge, including the article Biocolonialism and Indigenous Peoples' Knowledge in United Nations Discourse in 2011, for also the Griffith Law Review entitled Indigenous Peoples and Gene Disputes, the Chicago Kent Law Review. Deborah Harry.
Pisha uwamwa inamurui. Nuk inaniat kuitnap pukut mogotni. My name is Chief Eagle Horsewoman. My given name is Deborah Harry. Nukuyui Dakota. I'm a Kwiwi eater. Nukuyui Pop. My homeland is a place known as Pyramid Lake, Kuyui Water. I extend my greetings and acknowledge that we are in the ancestors and acknowledge the ancestors and the nations of this region of Great Turtle Island. I also extend my warm, heartfelt greetings to many of the friends, spiritual leaders, ceremony keepers, language keepers, everyone who is here working for the benefit of our future generations. I want to start my talk today at the beginning. That is the beginning of my world, in my homelands in the desert, as described in one of our creation stories.